Hello and welcome to the Ricardian Podcast. In this episode, we cast the spotlight on the life and career of the man who called himself Richard of England, but is better known by the name given to him, Perkin Warbeck. Born in around 1474, this individual would claim to be one of the two so-called princes in the Tower, that is, the sons of Edward IV and the nephews of Richard III, whose precise fates remain a mystery to this day. He would go on to make several attempts on the crown of England in the 1490s in a bid to unseat Henry VII, who had himself taken the throne by conquest at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485. Joining me to talk about the life of Richard of England, or Perkin Warbeck, is the historian, writer and presenter Matt Lewis, whose books include The Survival of the Princes in the Tower. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me back.
It's a pleasure. We're also joined by Wendy Moorhen, a researcher into this era who has written a fascinating article about a critical point in the life of Richard of England / Perkin Warbeck, covering the years 1487 to 1492. And that's for the June edition of the Ricardian Bulletin, the members' magazine of the Richard III Society, which is out shortly. Welcome to you, Wendy.
Thank you for having me back as well.
Brilliant. Right, let's get going then. Matt Lewis, let's turn to you first. Could you please offer an introduction to the kind of origins and early life of a man who called himself, well, at least three things, but one of them was Richard of England?
Yeah, and I guess the introduction to his early life depends on which one of those names you choose to believe might have been the correct one for him. So the name that he claimed was his own is Richard of England. So that is Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the second son of Edward IV. And he is born in August 1473 in Shrewsbury, just up the road from me, in the glorious Welsh Marches, and is the younger brother of the heir to the throne at that point, Edward, the future Edward V, who is then Prince of Wales. And he's given the title Duke of York and kind of begins that tradition of the second son of the monarch being given the title of the Duke of York, because the House of York is now the ruling house of England. He is in one of those bizarre medieval moments. He's married in 1478 at the age of 5 years old to a little girl named Anne Mowbray. And this is about getting the Mowbray inheritance of the Duchy of Norfolk into the royal family for Edward IV. She unfortunately passes away while still very young in 1481, so 3 years after they're married. And in 1483, his father passes away. Edward IV passes away fairly unexpectedly at the age of 40. And Richard is then 9 years old. His older brother, Edward, the new King Edward V, is 12. Richard is brought up in London around the royal court, whereas his older brother is brought up in Ludlow to be Prince of Wales. So part of the story that's important later on is Richard is the one of the princes who is a much more recognisable face around London. People will have encountered him in London and around court much more regularly than Edward V. And in 1483, he and his brother end up in the Tower of London preparing for Edward V's coronation. That coronation will never take place. And then at some point during the summer of 1483, they cease to be seen in the Tower and are not officially recorded anywhere else in the histories. So if this person who emerges in the 1490s is the real Richard, Duke of York, then the version of his story that we get comes largely from the kind of life story that has emerged from the Missing Princes project. There's also a letter that he writes to Queen Isabella. There's also a letter that he writes to Queen Isabella in Spain, which gives some slightly different details as well, just to confuse the matter. But he essentially says he was taken out of the Tower in 1483, whisked over the sea to the continent to safety, and protected by a couple of people who later on abandoned him. If you think this person is not the real Richard, Duke of York, then we know very, very little about him. So he must have been born somewhere around 1473, 1474 to have been the right sort of age to pass as Richard, Duke of York. He must have been able to be convincingly the same age. The stories that emerge later, which culminate in his confession, which is extracted, I don't know, after his capture, essentially say that he is a lad from Tournai. There are various versions of what his father's job was, some kind of boatman, some kind of merchant, runs a ship there. There does seem to have been a Warbeck family who are living in Tournai around about this time. We get lots of variations of the name that's given for him, from Piers Erzbeck to Pierre Warbeck, and all kinds of variations of it, which I think you can put down to, Tournai is a place that's on this kind of nexus of France and Belgium and other places. There's a bit of a melting pot of languages there. Names might get recorded in various different versions in that period. And his story seems to go that his father, this kind of merchant or boatman in Tournai, puts him into service as an organ maker, an apprentice as an organ maker, and he doesn't like this, so he runs away. So this is kind of where their two stories collide, that either Richard, Duke of York, has been removed from the Tower, kept in safety on the continent for a while, or Perkin Warbeck has been signed up for a job by his dad that he doesn't want to do, and he runs away. And this is kind of the point where those two versions of events begin to collide.
And the kind of the bit that was in unspoken, because you're very close to the subject, is that in the summer of 1483, after the death of his father, his brother becomes king, but then isn't crowned because Richard III becomes king instead, because of a whole sea of other discussions we've talked about separately. Okay, so but in 1487 or so, this is like the moment in The Man in the Iron Mask where the two different people come together and they become the same person. That whether you believe he's real or not, we know that the person that called himself Richard of England and who was called by other people potentially, or was Perkin Warbeck, is in the Low Countries. And I think this brings us to you, Wendy, and the article you've just written for the Bulletin, which covers this sort of kind of interesting period in presumably, well, in his late adolescence, if he's or middle adolescence, if he's 12, 13, 14, and into adulthood, where he, we pick up the story, and the man called Edward Brampton seems to be at the heart of it. Could you take us through Edward Brampton and what he does and how he affects the life and times of Richard of England / Perkin Warbeck?
Okay, well, Brampton was born Duarte Brandão in Portugal. He was a Jew, and he left Portugal quite young. He immigrated to England, and he converted to Christianity. And as was the custom of the day, Edward IV was his godfather. And he entered the service of Edward as a sailor, as a soldier. He was quite useful. Every indication is he went to France on the expedition in 1475, and there he met Charles the Bold. Apparently he was sponsored by him. He also met the exiled Alfonso V of Portugal, and he loaned money to King Alfonso, and when the king went back to Portugal, was reinstated, he gave trading privileges to Brampton. And Brampton stayed for a while. He established himself in Bruges as a merchant. He continued his service with Edward. He was flitting across the Channel. And when Edward died, he and Richard became king. He transferred service to Richard. He was knighted. And intriguingly, Richard gave him an annuity of £100 per annum for 20 years. We don't know why, and there's been much speculation about this. But this is when he really becomes a person of interest. In March 1485, he's sent on a mission to Lisbon, and consequently he misses the Battle of Bosworth. So when Tudor is successful to successfully usurp the throne of England, Brampton stays in Bruges, and he starts to expand his business. The following year, Maximilian returned from being crowned king of the Romans. He returned to the Low Countries, and he brought his father with him, Frederick, who of course was the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Frederick had been literally thrown out of Vienna. The king of Hungary had invaded, and Frederick needed to raise money for an army to get him out. And the way he did this, he decided to collect the dowry of his late wife, Eleanor of Portugal. And Brampton became involved in this transaction, and in fact he subrogated the debt. Now this was for 28,000 golden ducats, and if we assume that a ducat was minted from 24-carat gold, that would equate to something like £12 million today, an enormous sum of money. It's almost unbelievable. However, Brampton was finding things difficult in Bruges, and he decided he would move back to Lisbon. He arrived there. He had a meeting with King Jao at Santarem. He was granted various privileges, properties, became a councillor. He really had arrived back in his home country. But he now had to get his wife and family out of Bruges and to Lisbon. And this is where the stories start to converge with Richard or with Perkin, whichever you choose to believe. His wife went on a ship called the Queen's Ship, taking, I'm going to call him for the time being, the boy with her. And what is quite interesting and what is, I think, significant, this was in Easter 1487. Just a few days afterwards, another ship sailed from the same port, Middelburg, carrying John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, and Francis Lovell, Viscount Lovell, to Dublin. And there they crowned a boy called Edward, King of England. My interpretation for many, many years has been that one boy was being promoted, was going to go for the crown, go for England, but the spare was being moved somewhere safe. We're just talking 2 to 3 weeks difference. And where safer perhaps than Portugal, where there were connections with England. And one has to ask the question, why would somebody who's rubbing shoulders, Brampton, rubbing shoulders with the kings of Portugal, King of the Romans, kings of England, the Holy Roman Empire, why would he pick up a boy from Tournai and take him to Lisbon? Unless, of course, he was actually taking the real Richard, Duke of York. It's speculative, but it's a question that needs to be considered.
Matt, can I bring you in there? And would you have any thoughts on the narrative that Wendy has sketched out?
I do think it's really interesting, where those things happening around the same time is really, really interesting. Brandon getting the, £100 a year from the king for 20 years. That is a lot of money. He must have been doing some good service for that. Was that keeping an eye on one of the princes in the Tower, kind of overseas where he is working and living? And I guess, Wendy is absolutely right. It's a really interesting aspect of it, of why would Brandon, because I think when you get a little bit later on in Brandon's explanations of it, you get this kind of really convoluted thing of, this kid turned up on his wife's doorstep and he didn't want to take him, but then he ended up hiding or getting on board and something happened. And I didn't want this kid here, but he's ended up here.
Yeah.
And it's almost like Brandon is having to kind of jump through some hoops to explain why he's brought this boy from Tournai to Portugal, whose dad clearly doesn't know about it. Because, there's one of the other stories is that his dad bumps into a Portuguese representative in Bruges and is like, have you seen my son? In Tournai. And it's like, have you seen my son? Gives him the physical description. Go, oh, yes, I know that boy. There's all these kind of weird, unlikely things that have to line up for the story of Brandon taking this boy without his father's permission to Portugal to make sense.
Okay, so all right, so that's Brampton. When do we know what Richard Perkin was up to in Lisbon? When was he there? He was there for a couple of years, or?
He's probably there for longer than a couple of years. He was placed in the service of a man called Pero Vaz de Cunha, who was what I believe is called in Portuguese a fidalgo, but essentially he was a courtier. He was certainly known to King Jao. So the boy was moving in royal circles. He probably attended the wedding of the infant Afonso, Jao's son, who sadly died the following year. So he was remembered, I found recently, a guy called Garcia de Resande, who was also a page to the king, wrote some memoirs and history of the king. And when Richard appeared on the European stage, he remembered him. He can remember seeing this boy at the court. Doesn't name him, interestingly, but there's, I think, more work to be done. We may be able to learn a little more of what he was up to in the probably about 3 years he was in Lisbon.
Okay, brilliant. Now let's then sort of move it forward. In your article, there's several more kind of people of interest who are connected with taking this boy, Richard, from where he is, as it were, later on. We've got Roger Mercado is one of them, and then there's a silk merchant called Pregent Mino. Could you give us an overview of the next stages and where Richard / Perkin goes next?
Okay. Well, Roger Mercado was also Portuguese. He also served Edward IV. He was known in the reign as Leicester Herald. And if the Herald's memoir is correct, he actually attended the marriage of Richard of Shrewsbury to Anne Mowbray, and he was at the funeral of King Edward. However, unlike Brampton, he did not have a relationship with Richard III. He, in fact, went to work for the Marquis of Dorset, carried out some missions for him, and he then transferred his loyalty to Henry Tudor. He accompanied Tudor on his invasion of England, and he was promoted to Richmond Herald. He held various titles of Herald, but is generally in history referred to as Richmond. Now, in 1489, an embassy was sent to Lisbon by Henry Tudor, and basically it was to renegotiate or to confirm the Treaty of Windsor, which had been in existence for many years and was put together when Philip of Lancaster married into the Portuguese royal house. And it was subsequently renewed every reign. And they were also going to present to him the Order of the Garter. They completed their business with the king and they moved to Lisbon, and they spent a week there with the London merchants who were resident in the city. And all these people were all merchants. They all may have had official roles, but they were always trading. So we've got the situation where Brampton is actually hosting this event or events during the course of the week. And they're both Portuguese. They both served King Edward. And hey, I guess they had quite a session with each other. One of the things they would probably have discussed was the fact that Brampton wanted to be reconciled to the king. And I would imagine they also discussed the boy who Brampton had taken to Lisbon a couple of years before. Mercado went back to England. He reported to the king, and it was recorded that his lands would be restored to him. He was granted a pardon. And what was very interesting is that Mercado was also sent back to Lisbon immediately. He received 20 marks for his return journey. So there was something which had interested the king. No doubt it was this boy, and if he was a threat. Now, the other character was, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Prigent Menno. He was not a silk merchant. He actually dealt in raw wool. And the story there is that the boy decided to leave Lisbon for Cork. He'd been advised to do so by his minder, Henry Percy, who died. And he was to seek out the Earls of Kildare and Desmond. So he took a ship to Cork. And that ship was owned by this Prigent Menno, who was a Breton raw wool merchant, owned his own ship. And they duly arrive in Cork around about the end of 1491, about probably late November, early December. What is very strange is that Henry Tudor was aware of this arrival. And as soon as Menno sailed away from Cork, a ship was sent in pursuit, and Menno was captured and interrogated. Henry obviously had excellent intelligence and needed to know more about this person who'd been delivered to Cork. Menno turned Queen's evidence, or I should say King's evidence these days. He went to work for Tudor, and he's recorded as having trading privileges. He became the constable of Carrickfergus Castle, and he became a denizen of England. So no doubt he told the king everything he knew about this young passenger he had. The plot now thickens even further, because a few days after the arrival, another two ships actually arrived from Honfleur in France, and on board was a man called John Taylor Sr., another Yorkist servant, but one who still was faithful to the House of York. He's currently working for King Charles. Now, at this point in time, Tudor and King Charles were head-to-head over Brittany. And if Charles could make life difficult for Tudor, he would. So he concocted a plan which involved Scotland, English sympathisers of the Yorkists in England, and the dissident earls in Ireland for an plot, ideally to depose Henry Tudor. It didn't work, of course. But Taylor duly arrived, and he would obviously meet up with this boy. From the confession, there is quite a lot about what happened when, I'll now call him Perkin for the moment, when Perkin arrives, that he parades himself in Cork. He's wearing expensive clothing, silks, And people are automatically just sort of getting excited and saying, hey, here's the Earl of Clarence, or no, it's John of Gloucester, Richard's son, or it's Richard, Duke of York, which really is something, I think it's just an absolute folderol. And hence the reason why some people considered Puget-Minot to be a silk merchant. It was wool. Now, this has to be some kind of orchestration here, that the fact that these two people arrive in Cork at the same time and what subsequently happens, there was some orchestration. How, why, or where, we don't know. Did Brampton manage to get messages to Henry that the boy was coming, or was it other sources, Brittany, France? We don't know. But now Richard is in Cork. He proclaims himself Richard of England, and his career now starts.
And if I've read your article correctly, it's at this sort of time where Henry tries to move in on him, and as a result of this, Richard of England, as he's calling himself, accepts an invitation from Charles VIII to go to France in order to escape Henry's clutches, as it were. But then Henry VII launches this invasion of France in 1492, which culminates with the Treaty of Étampes and a big deal, which is the French will stop backing Richard of England, and in return, Henry recognises Charles's sovereignty over Brittany. That's correct, Matt? Is that how that shakes up?
That's essentially what happened, Jen. I think the interesting thing about that invasion is that Henry VII launches it going into the winter of 1492, out of campaigning season, which clearly smacks to me of him being desperate. And what could he possibly be desperate about that time if it's not the fact that this boy is at the French court being trumpeted as the Duke of York? So it just makes me think that Henry is really worried. He spends most of the 1490s desperately trying to portray himself as completely unfazed by this boy because he knows he's a fraud. He can't bother me. He calls him the garçon all the time just to, discredit him as the boy. But I think Henry's actions speak against his words. He seems to me like someone who is pretty concerned, at least at this point.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, let's before we go on to the next phase, at the end of your article, Wendy, you say that it wasn't until July 1493, and I quote, that Henry first named the boy or garçon Perkin Warbeck of Tournai, and a further year before his father's identity was established. That's in inverted commas. Then my question is, how was Brampton involved in this invention, as you would say, of Perkin Warbeck? That comes in a document later on, doesn't it?
Yes, well, the document comes from 1496, which came about because the Catholic monarchs were negotiating the hand of Catherine of Aragon with Prince Arthur and Henry VII. But the testimonials were taken in Portugal. And Brampton starts off by saying how dreadful it was that the princes in the Tower were murdered. That's how he begins. And then he goes on to supply information about this boy from Tournai, which all seems to turn up in the confession later on. So this is probably the start of it. And Tudor has got to establish this persona, and it does take him a little while.
Okay, so that's 1492, 1493. Okay, Matt, let's go back. So it's the 1490s, and we've got a sense here already of the sort of people who are backing Richard of England. Perkin is in the court of France, and then, of course, he leaves France after Henry does a deal with Charles at the Treaty of Étampes and returns to Burgundy. And then there are one or two, or rather three invasion attempts, or attempts to get the throne. There's I think two in 1495, and there's another one in 1497. Could I ask you to quickly give us an overview of Richard of England's attempts to seize the throne, if you would?
Yeah, definitely. I think just to sum up as well what you're talking about, Brampton's possible involvement in the creation of Perkin Warbeck, there's lots of speculation that he may have been one of the people who was given responsibility for looking after Richard, Duke of York, when he's taken from the Tower. Is that what he was given money for? I'm not sure. But Bernard André's account of these events says that Richard of England claimed that he'd been brought up by a converted Jew whose name was Edward. And the Jew was my master, and he was in the intimate circle of the king and his children. Well, I mean, if that's not Edward Brampton that he's claiming had brought him up, then I don't know who it is. So if Edward Brampton had custody of the younger of the princes in the Tower on the continent, is it possible that they had a kind of false identity for him kind of in their back pocket, ready to go. You know, like a spy film when they pull out the bag full of passports and cash and stuff like that. Was this Perkin Warbeck identity something that Brandon had been kind of, keeping on the back burner in case he ever needed it? And rather than use it to protect Richard, does he use it to feed something to Henry in order to ingratiate himself to the King of England? I don't know. But yes, so he's kicked out of France as a result of the Treaty of Étaples, spends a while with Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, who would be his aunt if he is the younger of the princes in the Tower. Gets really heavily backed by the Holy Roman Emperor, spends a bit of time moving through the empire as well, and then essentially decides to kind of go to Ireland to try his luck there again. Doesn't have too much luck, pushes on to Scotland, is welcomed in Scotland by James IV, married to Catherine Gordon, and they kind of, on his way there, I missed out the first invasion. The first one, he tries to land at Deal as he's sailing around, and is kind of, a few of his men are apparently caught on the shore, the rest of them don't land, and I think this is meant to give us our first indication that he's not a physically or militarily brave or capable person. He's sort of driven off by a load of locals off the beach of Deal.
The so-called Battle of Deal.
Which isn't a battle.
Right, okay.
And he sails onto Ireland, has no joy there, gets to Scotland. James IV welcomes him, marries him to Catherine Gordon, and they launch an invasion over the border. And again, the sources tell us that almost as soon as they began fighting, that Richard is shocked and repulsed by the violence and everything else, and he literally turns around and goes back over the Scottish borders and says, "I'm not doing this," much to James's frustration. Eventually, he leaves Scotland. Again, finds no joy in Ireland, and he ends up landing in Cornwall, where there has recently been a tax rebellion, and maybe he's trying to harness the unrest in that region. But he arrives a little bit late in 1497. He's kind of missed the wave, and he ends up going into hiding, into sanctuary kind of thing at Beaulieu Abbey. And this is where Henry will have him kind of surrounded, brought out, and captured.
So that sounds like 3 concerted attempts. He's got married into some sort of noble or royal connections in Scotland. He's got the King of Scotland on his side. I suppose the question is, how does this boatman son from Tournai make this happen? And the answer you'll give is, well, he's not that person. But he's obviously got a lot of money from somewhere, hasn't he?
I think the thing is, if at this point he's a fraud, then he's encountering an awful lot of people who are very, very willing to be convinced by a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
And you can construct a view in which all of those people, the King of Scotland has something to gain by having an enemy of the King of England in his court, undoubtedly. But does that mean that James is going to say, as a king, that this person I've got in my court is a rightful king if he knows he's a boatman's son from Tournai? How is Richard / Perkin fooling all of these people on the continent, Margaret of Burgundy, who is English, people who get involved in this conspiracy like Robert Clifford, who is English. They don't think that he's a lad from Tournai. In his confession, Perkin, as he's then known, will claim that he's forced to learn to speak English against his will at the age of 16. I mean, I know I'm from Wolverhampton and I struggle to speak English at the best of times, but, the idea that you can be forced against your will to learn English at 16 and speak it so perfectly, speak courtly English in such a perfect accent that you can fool English people, I find almost absurd.
Yeah, okay. And there's also the documents have turned up, from Duke Albrecht of Saxony, the Wolkenstein charters, various other, with thousands of marks or whatever ducats being handed over to this guy, or he's promising to repay them when he gets his throne back. So there's a big money trail following him around as well to pay for the mercenaries and his gang of people who are following him around.
Yeah, and I think that if you see, the criticism you see most often of that, particularly that financial document, is that the fact that it's signed Richard of England doesn't really prove he's Richard of England, because of course he's going to sign it Richard of England. Yeah. But it kind of lends weight to the idea that the Duke who's lending him money believes that's who he is, because if he's signing it under a false name, he's not legally bound by that document then, is he? So if this guy wants his money back, he's got to believe he's lending it to the real person who is signing that document. So although it doesn't prove he is who he said he is, I think it lends weight to the idea that those backing him must have believed he was who he was. Otherwise, why would you enter into legal agreements with a legal fiction? Because you're never going to get your money back.
Yeah, okay. So, it doesn't, I think I've got a sense of the answer already, but how close did he get to becoming King Richard IV?
I mean, I would say he gets nowhere near it. The English leg of his conspiracy is kneecapped by the defection of Robert Clifford, who goes back to England in 1494 and hands over people like William Stanley, who are, the numbers in England seem to be quite high, who were willing to at least consider involvement in his claim to the throne. The invasion at Deal is a complete disaster. The invasion from Scotland is a complete disaster. The invasion of Cornwall is a complete disaster. He manages to accumulate, I think, all of the tools, the equipment that's necessary to launch these bids. He's got backing from crowned heads of Europe. He's got money almost coming out of his ears, but he just can't make it work. He's clearly not suited for that. And I think the argument that's often used is that means he can't be Edward IV's son. It's like, well, please don't tell me I'm like my dad. So that doesn't necessarily prove anything to me. But I would say that he really doesn't come anywhere near to actually making himself king.
Okay, so Wendy, what's your sense of why Richard of England, Perkin, fails in his attempt to get the throne?
Oh, exactly for the reasons Matt has said. Deal was just it was just coming. Clifford completely scuppered any support from England. And it's interesting that in 1490 he was on a mission to Brittany with Roger Ricardo. So they knew each other as well. So I often wonder the invasion of Scotland when he ran away. I'm fairly certain one of the reasons he might have backed away was the fact that his wife was about to give birth. And maybe they were obviously devoted. And maybe he was worried about her, and that's why he retreated to Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with Matt, he didn't really come close.
But one thing that comes across is reading your article as well about the kind of the treachery. But there's also he's up against a really formidable opponent, Henry VII. He's a ruthless mover, and he's obviously got spies. He's got this. I mean, is there any sense that a lot of people would have failed against Henry VII because he was so dangerous?
Absolutely. I think Henry VII is the epitome of suspicion, and that makes him very, very difficult to fool and to maneuver around. I think here is a guy who is willing to launch an invasion of France in December 1492 because he's worried about what the King of France is up to with one of his enemies. He has avoided efforts to seize him, to take him captive while he's in exile on the continent before he's king, quite often by being tipped off by people from England about what the King of England is up to. He knows the value of spies and information and being able to act quickly and how to cut off support, how to prevent plots that have been exposed from working. And so to some extent, yes, I think lots of people would have failed against Henry VII because having got himself on the throne, he's a man with all of the tools to stay there.
Well, let's turn to the end zone then for Richard of England. Matt, I think you might have acknowledged it, but obviously he's defeated after the uprising in Cornwall and he's taken prisoner. And then what happens then? He's executed. But why is he executed in the final analysis? What happens?
I mean, all of this is such an interesting story. He's captured in the West Country. He's kept there for a long time. He signs this confession. Bernard Andre, in his account, is clear that he's beaten by the royal servants before he signs the confession. He's eventually taken back to London. Are the beatings because of what I mentioned earlier? He's the face that is more familiar around London, around the court. He's the one people might recognise, and Henry can't have that. We get a herald's account that says that his one eye is destroyed and that he is no longer good looking. So is he being, beaten to the point where he's almost unrecognizable just in case anyone spots who he is? But the weird thing is that he gets to, this guy who's invaded Henry VII's kingdom 3 times, gets to London and is kept in basically loose house arrest at court. He's kept away from his wife, presumably so they can't have any children. She's put in the household of Elizabeth of York. But he's kept loosely at court. I mean, who responds to 3 invasions of their kingdom by doing that? Eventually, he seems to have made an effort to escape. He's captured so quickly that this smells of Henry sort of staging the opportunity for him to escape and sort of having him egged on to escape so that he can take him back into custody and put him in the Tower of London. He then becomes wrapped up in another supposed escape attempt with the Earl of Warwick, who is the only other male Yorkist heir in male line Yorkist heir in England at the time. They are wrapped up in this supposed plot to escape from the Tower of London so that they can both be arrested. Warwick is beheaded. Perkin, as he's by then known, is made to reread his confession on the gallows and hanged because he has to be hanged for trying to escape custody because he can't actually be tried for treason because Henry has said he's not an English subject. He's someone from Tournai. So Henry has to be really, really careful about what he does with Perkin. If he tries him for treason, he's admitting he's English, which is really dangerous.
Okay, so so that's the end, and he's definitely killed. With that he doesn't survive. He doesn't pop up again.
I mean, unless you want to do a full-on like Man in the Iron Mask thing and say that he's beaten so badly that someone is put in his place, and he's so disfigured.
But the consensus is he's definitely killed.
Everyone is pretty clear that he is executed at Tyburn in 1499.
Okay. All right, then let's turn to his legacy. Wendy, I'll start with you. He was 25, 26 when he died. He never got the throne. But does Richard of England have a legacy? Does Perkin have a legacy as such?
Yes, it's a sad one, really, because he's stuck with this pantomime name of Perkin Warbeck. Why couldn't he have just been Pierre Warbeck? But no, it's always this Perkin or Pierre or some other version of it. And it's really just would become an historical joke. And I think it featured in 1066 and all that, because you've also got Lambert Simnel with a similar pantomime name. So this is probably how he's come down. And although novelists might have written in his favour, history hasn't. Richard's rehabilitation started a long time ago with Sir George Buck, but not our Richard. And it is such a shame. It really took it until 1990 when Diana Klein wrote her book. And of course, now we are seriously questioning his identity, obviously prompted so much by the incredible work of Philippa Langley.
Yeah.
But it was an anecdote, but about 20 years ago, I was at a conference in Cambridge and I was talking to an Oxbridge Don. And we were discussing Richard, Perkin, Catherine. And this academic looked at me and said, I know it's heresy, but you do just wonder if he was who he said he was. And this was a very well-respected historian, and I was completely gobsmacked and utterly delighted.
Okay, well, let's ask that question. Matt, you've said in writing in the bulletin that you're personally convinced that the man who called himself Richard, Duke of York, was who he said he was. Are you prepared to put a percentage on your level of being convinced about that? Is it 100%? Was it 80%?
No, I don't think it can ever be 100%. I'm going to put it somewhere around about 90. There is doubt. There is definitely doubt in there somewhere. But there are so many things. Like if you did a pros and cons list, the pros column for him really being Richard, Duke of York is so much more full of compelling evidence to me than the cons column would be. So I would say I'm 90% convinced. I don't think I can be 100% convinced, but I'm as certain as I can be.
Okay, Wendy, what do you have? Can you put a number to it? Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming you're pretty convinced.
Oh, yeah, of course. But I mean, I actually go between 80 and 90, and it depends what book I've read last. Like sometimes you read something, you read something Ian Alderson has said, you think, oh gosh, he's got a point there. You do worry about it. You do go up and down. But yeah, I mean, I'd probably end up at 90%.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so is there a way that we can find out for definite? In the way, obviously, the miracle of, in a way, of finding Richard III's remains and then conducting a DNA test. Is there any way that there's a hope that we could find a burial or something? Is that Matt? Is there any possibility?
There's a couple of options. So we know that when Perkin was executed, he was buried at the Greyfriars in London, which was bombed during the Blitz and is now under the Dutch New Church. So it depends whether you could locate where Perkin's grave was before the new church was built on it and whether it still survives, which is such a long shot.
Yeah.
The other potential avenue is the bones that are in the urn in Westminster Abbey. Now, I'm convinced they're not the princes in the tower. Again, I can't be 100% sure of that. So if we were able to DNA test them, if they are the princes in the tower in that urn, then it proves Perkin Warbeck was a fraud. And it's about the only thing that testing those remains can really definitely tell us.
Yeah.
But if that is the princes, it proves he's a fraud. But if it's not the princes in the urn, it doesn't prove that Perkin is real. So it's really limited. We really don't have too many options to get any closer to this, short of more documentation turning up.
Now, in your book, I think you mentioned that a guy called John Clement, who's buried in, is it Mechelen Cathedral? I mean, can we do a
Mechelen
DNA
Cathedral.
test on him?
Yes, so we vaguely know where he is. This is a theory that was put forward by an amateur art historian, Jack Leslaw. It's like Da Vinci Code. I love it. I absolutely obsess over all of this. So he was convinced that a man named John Clement, who was a head of the Royal College of Physicians in the Tudor period, is a real genuine person connected to the household of Thomas More, remains a Catholic, so leaves England during Elizabeth I's reign, somehow ends up buried at the high altar of Mechelen Cathedral. We don't quite know why. That's where the ducal family of Burgundy is buried. Don't know why some random guy from England ends up buried there. But Jack Leslaw had kind of roughly tracked down where the grave was. So if he is a relative of the princes in the Tower, potentially that's another body that we could look for to go and DNA test.
Okay. Last question then. Given we think he was who he said he was. Hey, Henry VII launched the invasion of France with 26,000 soldiers because of the fact that the French king was sheltering him. He's being aided and abetted by his aunt. I'll always be give it. What do we call him? Because we've spent the last 45 minutes calling him Richard of England or Richard of York, and then / Perkin Warbeck. Other people have discussed using inverted commas. What do we call the guy? Or does he have to have a hyphen? Forever have a hyphen until we get more evidence? Matt, do you want to go first on that?
If I'm entirely honest with you, I'm not entirely certain it matters what we call him. Perkin Warbeck is the name that most people will know who you're talking about if you say Perkin Warbeck. If you start saying Richard of England, people will be like, what, Richard I, Richard II, Richard III, Richard Duke of York? Which Richard are we on? So the Richard of England requires an awful lot more explanation. I think it can depend on the context of the audience you're talking to, the parts of the story that you're talking about. I think if I'm forced to call him something, why don't we call him what he called himself? Richard of England. It doesn't mean he was that person, but this is the name that the guy used all of his life, and it feels like a lot to deprive him of the name that he gave himself, even if he'd made it up. No, we don't hold it against Hulk Hogan that it's not his real name, do we?
Well, I did. Wendy, I assume that you're pretty much in broad agreement with Matt there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly he was known as Richard of England or Richard Duke of York on the continent. If you're talking about him once he's arrived in England, then he is always referred to as Perkin Warbeck, and that's where it does get complicated. But, I think I'm happy to go with Richard of England. Yep.
Brilliant. Well, it sounds like it'd be a great feature film whenever it comes to pass. Guys, thank you very much. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this edition of the Ricardian Podcast, which is brought to you by the Richard III Society. If you'd like to find out more about the life and times of Richard III, and you aren't already a member of the Society, then please do look at the website of richard3rd.net. That's Richard followed by 3i's.net. There's lots more information there about Richard and his world, plus everything you need to know about membership and member benefits, which include, of course, the quarterly magazine, the bulletin, which we've been talking about today. Guys, the last thing to do is say thank you very much indeed to our guests, Matt Lewis and Wendy Moorhen. Thank you very much for walking us through the life of Richard of England. It's been amazing, and I hope all of you have been enjoying it too. If you have enjoyed the podcast, please do rate it, share it, pass it on, spread the word. Until next time, then, that's all from us. Thank you and goodbye.